Ida B. Wells, we see a person who focused on facts and not fluff. And why I mention fluff is because too much of our media today is misinformed and shallow. But in many ways, it's a continuation of what was happening in Ida B. Wells' time, and actually what was happening before. One of the very first things published by Black Americans, and one of the first things published by blacks here in Philadelphia, was a rebuttal that was published in 1794 about a white journalist misrepresenting what black people did during the yellow fever epidemic of 1793. So these stories recur and recur and recur. Ida B. Wells unmasked the lies that undergirded lynching, and that's very important. When I talk about misinformed, the fluff stuff, this Monday, it was what? The inauguration of President Obama, excuse me, for those who may get prickly if you say Barry or Obama. And it was also Martin Luther King's holiday. So we have all of these news media people down in Washington, D.C., and they're all telling us their story. And so we had this guy from Channel 3, Chris May. I'm on the mall, and Martin Luther King was a civil rights pioneer. My ears like say, what? A civil rights pioneer? Well, we are talking about a civil rights pioneer this evening, Ida B. Wells. And King was born 2 years and 2 months after she died, or before she died. So if pioneer means being one of the first to do something, then how is it that King can be a pioneer when Ida B. Wells was a pioneer? And she took the baton from other people who were pioneers in this long and continuing fight for civil rights. And if what he said was ill-informed, rather malicious or whatever, is still bad, he handed it off to his co-anchor, Susan Barnett, and she says, well, the burning question of the day is, I'm saying, oh, okay, Obama's wars in Africa, cut Social Security, child deaths in Chicago. No, the burning question of the day was, what dress is Michelle Obama going to wear to the ball? Ida B. Wells is known as an advocacy journalist. And yes, she did do a lot of advocacy in her journalism by pointing out what was right. She did what journalists are supposed to do. We have this First Amendment right because the founders, and we can say what we want to say about them, and there's a lot of separate conversations we could have about them, but they had that First Amendment in place that press freedom for the media to provide information to the people, but also hold the government accountable to do what it's supposed to do on behalf of the people. So yes, she was an advocacy journalist, but I'm arguing this evening that within the context of these times and past times, that label of advocacy journalist may not be as much honorific as it is an effort of diminution, a term to diminish the type of journalist that she was. Well, she was a good journalist and she did something, but she was an advocacy journalist. She really wasn't a journalist. And the reality is, and let's be real, all journalism is advocacy. Either you're challenging the status quo, which is what Ida B. Wells did, or you're supporting the status quo, which is what most of the media does. The Wall Street Journal is what? An unashamed advocate of unbridled capitalism. Advocacy journalism. In 1898, November of 1898, was the only successful insurrection in the United States history, when a white mob led by a former congressman who was a Confederate Army colonel overthrew the elected government in Wilmington, North Carolina. Now, that happened within a climate where the newspapers all over the South were openly advocating for the lynching of black men as a way to protect white womanhood. And Ida B. Wells pushed back against that. Alexander Manley, who was the head of the editor of the newspaper in Wilmington, pushed back against that. And during this insurrection, the first target of the mob was Alexander Manly's press. And he had to flee his home in Wilmington, North Carolina. He ended up coming here to Philadelphia to live out his life. During that time, there was requests by people like Ida B. Wells to the president to have federal troops intervene. In the newspapers in North Carolina said it would be a crime to have the federal government come in and protect not only blacks who were being beaten, burned, and killed, driven into swamps where they stood in waist-deep water in late November to try to protect their lives. The newspaper said that would be a crime. Now, is this attitude about protecting the status quo something that just disappeared? No, it didn't. In 1851, about 100 miles west of here, there's a little town called Christiana. And in Christiana, there was an incident. Some people called it the riot of Christiana. Some people called it the uprising. But what happened is some folks from Maryland who were slave owners came up there searching for one of their slaves. And they thought that they found him, and they went in, and they were going to take him back, and the black folks out there said, oh no, not today. One of the slave owners, actually the one who was the lead slave owner, went back to Maryland in a pine box. His son was shot, and a couple other people were shot. The nation went berserk. Philadelphia Inquirer, September 15, 1851. Whatever may be the sentiment of our people on the abstract question of slavery, they are for obedience of the law. Now, that's an advocacy of the status quo. Abstract question of slavery? Slavery wasn't an abstract question to slaves. And it certainly wasn't an abstract question to free blacks who had begged the U.S. government from 1799, when people in Philadelphia put a petition to those people down at Independence Hall saying, we are being victimized, we are being kidnapped and illegally put back in slavery. Give us some protections of the law. But here was the Inquirer saying that, oh, slavery is an abstract question and anything related to it is abstract, but you got to follow the law. Well, the law wasn't being followed. So that's 1851. But let's think back. Let's think back to like within the last year and a half. The Philadelphia Inquirer did what? Well, there was a contract that the then school commissioner gave to a black firm to do some electrical work in a school down in South Philadelphia. And the Inquirer went berserk. Now, the reportage didn't say much at all about the paucity of contracts that minority firms were receiving from the school district. $1 billion a year in contracting, and we get just about nothing. Inquirer had nothing to say about it. The person who was writing those articles was a Pulitzer Prize winner, so it ain't like they didn't know what was going on. And why didn't they take the step a little further than that? One of the reasons why, beyond racism, that folks weren't getting these contracts is because there was a provision in place called a PLA, a project labor agreement, that set aside any contract worth more than $10,000. It mandated that they hire union workers. The same building trades unions in Philadelphia that W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out in his 1899 seminal book on the Philadelphia Negro that were racist against black people. This stuff never stops, and that's what's wrong. COINTELPRO. We hear about what they did, but what we don't hear is that the FBI used unpaid informants in the media to help target and discredit people. The Church Report, U.S. Senate investigative report on COINTELPRO. Much of the Bureau's propaganda efforts involve giving information to, quote, friendly media sources who could be relied upon not to reveal the Bureau's interests. People in the media cooperated with the FBI to target and destroy people, from Martin Luther King to the white left anti-war movement to the more militant side of our community, from the Black Panthers to the Republican New Africa. Is that something that just happened in the 70s? No. Look at Miami. About, what, 10 years ago? The Cuban Five. A group of Cuban intelligence agents that came over to the United States to keep an eye on terrorists in America who were attacking Cuba. And they were feeding information to the FBI, and the FBI turned around and accused them of espionage. The federal government paid Cuban journalists in Miami to dirty them up in the media at the time of their trial. These things continue on and on and on. Let me close with this. In March of 1968, there was this big report that came out, a presidential commission looking at violence in America. And, you know, why are these communities going up in smoke? And why are these Negroes rioting? Well, there was a chapter in there, chapter 15, that you never hear about, and that was an examination of the media and its racist practices. And one of the many findings that it said is that the media reports and writes from the standpoint of a white man's world. Inquirer, 1851, white man's world. North Carolina newspapers, 1898, white man's world. 1968, they find that. So is that old news, Professor Washington? Newark, New Jersey, December 2012. New York Times does an article on Cory Booker, the mayor of Newark. But in that article about a black mayor in a black city, they did not quote one black person. Not a congressman, not a councilman, not a community activist, no one. So the things that Ida B. Wells fought against are still happening today. And fortunately, we have this figure, this heroine, to look up to for us journalists and those of us who claim that we are black. We have the role models. The problem is we don't follow those role models. Thank you.